Good afternoon, and welcome to part one of our NTSB Most Wanted List Roundtable to discuss lowering the legal blood alcohol concentration threshold from 0.08 to 0.05. My name is Tom Chapman. I have the honor of serving as the 46th member of the National Transportation Safety Board. Let's start with a few housekeeping items. Today's roundtable is being recorded and it will be available for later viewing on the NTSB YouTube channel. You have been placed in listen-only mode for today's virtual session. If you have any questions for the presenters and panelists, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. One of our team members is monitoring the chat, and we will do our best to work in as many of your questions as possible within today's time frame. Today, we have 5 respected experts and leaders in this area, and they will share their insights with us. Each has worked tirelessly to advocate for a 0.05 BAC. I will offer a brief introduction for each panelist. However, their full biographies are included on the Roundtable event page, and I encourage you to take time to read their full backgrounds. It's been nearly a decade since NTSB recommended that all 50 states lower their BAC limit from 0.08 to 0.05. This was a key recommendation in our 2013 report entitled Reaching Zero: Actions to Eliminate Alcohol-Impaired Driving. Since then, only Utah has taken the bold step of lowering its BAC limit to 0.05. A law which took effect December 30th, 2018. Upon passage of that law, NHTSA launched an evaluation to examine the behavioral, social, and economical impact of the state of Utah and the impact on road safety. We'll hear more about the encouraging results of NHTSA's evaluation later in our session. Drunk driving has been with us since the automobile arrived on the scene more than 100 years ago. Many approaches to reduce alcohol-impaired crashes have been tried, and some have made a significant difference. Interlock devices that prevent convicted offenders from driving under the influence, DWI courts, education, and advocacy efforts. However, the number of crashes and deaths remains stubbornly high. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, 11,654 people died in 2020 as a result of alcohol-impaired driving. That was 30% of all traffic fatalities and represented a 14% increase from 2019. Further, NHTSA projects the final data will show that show that deaths in alcohol-related crashes actually increased an additional 5% in 2021. On average, 32 people in the United States die in drunk driving crashes every day. That's one person every 45 minutes. For almost 25 years, the proportion of highway deaths nationwide involving an alcohol-impaired driver has remained virtually unchanged at nearly 1/3. More needs to be done, and the evidence shows that lowering the legal BAC limit to 0.05 is one of the best tools we should be using to reduce traffic fatalities. Other countries have struggled with this safety issue just as the US has. Currently, more than 100 countries worldwide have BAC limits set at 0.05 or lower. The benefits of these sensible, safety-minded limits are well documented. When the BAC limits go down, impaired driving-related crashes decline too. As effective as a 0.05 BAC law would be in preventing crashes and saving lives, some interest groups will fight this approach tooth and nail. They will say that lowering the legal BAC limit doesn't target the drivers who are most likely to cause a crash, those operating vehicles at high BAC levels. Yet research has found that lowering the BAC threshold reduces impairment crash fatalities even at higher BAC levels. Lowering the legal BAC limit changes behavior at all BAC levels by reducing driving after drinking. Now, it is my honor to introduce you to our friend and NTSB colleague, Dr. Jana Price. Jana is a scientist who has conducted research on impaired driving for more than 2 decades. She led the NTSB research efforts that culminated in our 2013 report, Reaching Zero: Actions to Eliminate Alcohol-Impaired Driving. Again, it is that report which includes NTSB's original .05 safety recommendation. Jana, we're ready for your presentation.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for having me speak at this meeting today. I'm going to share my screen and get started. So, yes, so I'm excited to be here to speak about the history of our NTSB recommendation on .05. As you so rightly noted, we're coming up on a decade since NTSB first made that recommendation, which on one hand seems like a long time, but in fact, legislative efforts targeting blood alcohol concentration or BAC levels certainly predate our recommendation, and in fact predate it by many decades. And so to put that in perspective, I wanted to start out with a few snapshots from BAC history in the 20th century, many of which come from that I'm read in the book, the wonderful book by Baron Lerner, One for the Road, Drunk Driving Since 1900. And so, for example, as you can imagine, drunk driving dates to the act of driving itself, as you alluded. But in 1931, a biochemist from Indiana University invented a means to measure BAC, or blood alcohol concentration, in exhaled breath. And less than a decade later, Norway led the charge by passing the first .05 per se BAC law. So we had our first one almost 90 years ago. It took several decades before per se policies became commonplace in the United States. And in fact, the picture I have here comes from a 1968 investigation of a multi-fatal bus truck collision in Baker, California, that we, the NTSB, conducted shortly after NTSB became an independent agency. And I found it interesting when I recently reread that report and saw that NTSB noted that in that case, the truck driver, even though he had an estimated BAC between 0.15 and 0.19, was, quote, under the influence, but not, quote, officially drunk, effectively, because he was able to drive at all. So thankfully, our views have evolved considerably since that time. In the 1980s, we saw a lot of important legislation taking place in this space, largely due to the monumental efforts of the advocacy community. And those included first lowering per se BAC limits to 0.10 and later to 0.08. And we've even seen lower per se levels for populations such as drivers under 21 and commercial drivers. So fast forward there from 2000 to 2012, and by that time, NTSB had already issued over 100 recommendations concerning alcohol-impaired driving over 4 decades. And it was at that time, I was working at the agency then, and we decided to do kind of a comprehensive look back and undertake a series of efforts to look at the progress that had been made and where we still needed to go. And so this chart and the one that follows gives a snapshot of how things looked at that time. And you can see that there had been a lot of progress in the 1980s and 1990s in terms of reducing the both fatalities and the fatality rate from impaired driving, but that there was a general slowing and plateauing that occurred after that, which is even more evident when you look at the percent of fatalities associated with alcohol impaired driving over that period. So we decided to try to take a fresh look at countermeasures that worked and see what we could do about promoting those. And so in our 2013 Reaching Zero report, we took a broad view of alcohol impaired driving countermeasures to assess what we needed to do to move the needle. And that report, which is available on our website, made 19 different recommendations. And some of those recommendations focused on general deterrence, so things like high visibility enforcement, in-vehicle alcohol detection technology, and lowering per se limits were some that kind of had a very broad approach. Others focused on addressing specific deterrents of people arrested for impaired driving, such as ignition interlocks for all convicted offenders, administrative license actions, and DWI courts. Of course, in today's presentation, we're focusing on the 0.05 recommendation. So I'm just going to spend a minute talking about the NTSB's rationale for making that recommendation. So why does NTSB support lowering the per se BAC limit? Well, our research in the 2013 report documents decades of research overall, and among that, we know that performance decrements, driving-related performance decrements, start below 0.08. We know that crash risk begins to increase significantly around 0.05. We know that those countries, or for those populations that have lowered per se levels, have shown improvements in safety through reductions in crashes and fatalities. Also, as Tom alluded to in his intro, more than 100 countries since Norway did in 1936 have established per se BAC limits of 0.05 or lower. And at the time when we made our recommendations, several other traffic safety organizations and public health organizations had already done so, including the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, and AAAM. So here is the exact recommendation with its wording to the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. We called on them to establish blood alcohol concentration limit of 0.05 or lower for all drivers who were not already required to adhere to lower BAC limits. So as I mentioned, that report had 19 recommendations in it, but the one that did get a lot of attention coming out of that report was the 0.05 recommendation. So we got a lot of excitement and attention. Not all of that was positive attention, as I think some of our panelists today can attest, but it did receive a lot of attention. And we were excited that in the months and years that came after that, that other organizations stepped up to also support that recommendation and that policy. And for a while, it seemed like maybe it wouldn't get traction in states. But then a few years later, we were very excited and delighted to learn that Representative Norm Thurston of Utah was considering sponsoring a 0.05 bill. And he reached out to us. And I think some of our panelists, for example, Dr. Bella Dinzar, can speak to that, how that happened. And that bill, of course, ultimately became a law. And I'm excited to hear Amy Berning talk about NHTSA's subsequent evaluation of that law. And of course, other states, we're happy that they have taken steps towards such laws, although those bills have not ultimately come to fruition. It's something that we continue to advocate for. So with that, I will pass the floor to Amy to discuss the Utah law and NHTSA's study to evaluate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. That's an excellent background on the research and science behind our 0.05 recommendation. So next, let's turn to a discussion of how 0.05 works in practice. On December 30th, 2018, Utah became the first state in the United States to adopt an impaired driving per se BAC limit lower than 0.08. We are fortunate to be joined now by our friend Amy Berning from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Amy will brief us on NHTSA's evaluation of Utah's 0.05 BAC law. Amy, all yours.
Thank you so much, Member Chapman, and really thank you to NTSB for inviting NHTSA to present here. We really like getting the word out about our research and the results that we have, so thank you so much. I want to make sure to thank the state of Utah that worked with us through this whole project and provided much of the data, and we're just great colleagues through all of this. So looking at the background of how NHTSA was involved in this study, we're really well positioned as an agency to look at legislation such as this. We often examine legislation across different traffic safety areas, and really especially in alcohol impaired driving. We have decades of experience looking at the impact of legislation, and we have a good sense of the kinds of measures that are important to look for, and also other measures that might not seem relevant at the beginning, but then actually play a large role in figuring out the full impact of a state. And we were initially involved in this topic. We had the first study of when states were moving from higher limits to 0.08 a couple of decades ago. We were at the forefront looking at the impact in California, and then also the impact in Illinois as they lowered their limits, and then also other studies as well looking at 0.08. After, at that point, all states then did adopt, with a lot of effort from advocacy groups and legislators across the country. States all have adopted 0.08 at this point. And as we've noted here, Utah is the first state to lower its limit from now 0.08 to now 0.05. And the governor signed this on March 23, 2017. But I want to make the point that it didn't become effective until over a year later, December 30th of 2018, because I believe that they wanted to have a significant time frame to get ready for it, to make sure law enforcement was ready and just that everything was in order. Also, I want to point out that it was effective on December 30th of 2018 rather than the last day of the year. And I suspect that's so that they could have it effective for New Year's Eve. And I think that was a great strategy for them. So Utah and other states look to NHTSA to conduct evaluations such as this, and then we have other stakeholders that are interested. And for the research objectives and the measures that we used here, most typically people are interested in if there's going to be a change in fatalities and crashes, obviously, and those are very important, but we want to make sure that we're getting the full breadth of the issue, and we're going to take a look at other measures as well. So we also looked at impaired driving arrests, and then we wanted to know about people's perceptions of the law, their awareness of the law, that there is a law change. And for this, we really lucked out because we didn't have to do much here. The state of Utah had already done their own surveys and their own focus groups. And so we really only need to look at what they have, and then perhaps do some further analysis of the data that they had, and then package it with the rest of our information. So we thank them for that. And then our other indicators that we were interested in is looking at alcohol sales and other economic indicators, because we want to have a sense whether there's an unintended consequence of perhaps if there is reduced drinking, if that's going to impact the hospitality industry. And we want states, other states who are interested in moving for legislation to know what could be coming in whatever that is. And then in this study, we also examined the legislative process, and that resulted in the law change. So we really looked through all of the records and saw who was involved in the testimony, both for the law, testifying for it, and opponents of the law, and what was in their testimony, and then other stories that were in the media at this time. I want to point out that the researchers that did this work for us were Dunlap and Associates, and they were the ones out on the ground collecting this information, doing the analysis, and helping us with our report. And the report, I have a link at the end of this. We released it springtime of this year, and so that report and a 2-page summary is available. So I encourage everyone to go take a look at that. Important to know, our data collection timeframe ended before the COVID timeframe began. We specifically needed to do that so that we didn't have that as a covariate that we couldn't possibly attend to, but it's the timeframe of our data collection anyway, so it worked out well. But just so that question is answered ahead of time. So looking at crashes, and this is using Utah's own data. So this is the state level data crashes. And here you can see that there's a lot of, each of the rows coming down is a different measure. And we had a lot of different measures because, again, we're going for the breadth of the idea and trying to find out as much as we can about the driving behavior and the BACs of people who are driving and in the crashes. And so each of these rows is a different one. And these top ones, like single vehicle nighttime, those are often indicators across years in research of an alcohol-related crash. And then we, as you can see, we have people who are at BACs of 05 and above, 08 and above, and 15 and above in the crashes that we look at. And those are per vehicle miles traveled, and then drivers as well. Now, I want to point out, too, we have 2 columns here. One is called after the passage of the law. And then we have a separate one. The second column is after the law was in effect. Typically, we would only have in the results when the law took effect. But we are very aware that when legislation is getting changed, oftentimes the most conversation about, the most publicity about it is when the legislature is discussing it, when the governor is thinking of signing it, and that's when the media might have the most play and people are most aware. And so in some ways, that's as important of a time frame as when the law actually comes in effect, because many people don't know the days that laws come into effect. So we looked at both. None of these singular rows is the be all and end all question for us. It's really the compilation of these measures. And really what stands out more than anything is the negatives throughout all of them. There's decreases across all these measures, across the timeframes for both the passage of the law and then also when it went into effect. And the rows with asterisks are showing that there was a statistically significant change, downward change. Switching now, that was looking at Utah's own crash data. Now this is NHTSA's FARS data, which is specific to those who were involved in a fatality crash, where at least one person in the crash died. And in this graph, we are showing before the law change again, which is 2016 is where we have our first line coming down, and then 2019, the beginning of 2019 when the law came into effect. And looking at, we want to compare for Utah how their fatalities were going, but comparing them to the US as a whole, because it's one thing to know about the state, it's another thing to know how it is compared to the world around it. And here we can see that, yes, the US also had reductions in crashes, in fatalities. And the US rate for both the fatal crash rate, and the fatality rate came down around 5 to 6%. but Utah's rate, the reduction was significantly more in the 18 to 19, 20% range. Another way of taking a look at this is looking at, again, with the fatality data from NHTSA, and now we're looking at Utah compared to its local neighbors, so we can see if maybe it's a regional issue, that something happened in the region that's not unique to Utah other than the law change. So we looked at the fatality information for its neighbors, Colorado. They also had a reduction in fatalities, which is great. Nevada did as well. Arizona's fatality rate stayed the same. So, but Utah's, again, was much higher than its neighboring states, which is just another indication that the law change was had a significant impact. When we looked at our other measures, when we were looking at the DUI arrest, there was not a sharp climb in DUI arrest in 2019. There was a slight increase in 2019 in the number and proportion of arrests for those 05 to 079. When we look at the public awareness information that the state collected, we could see that in 2018, about 25% of drinkers and 13% of non-drinkers already thought the limit was 05. And in 2019, 22% of the drinkers reported they were changing their behaviors, that they had started changing their behaviors when the law went into effect. And the most common change was ensuring that they had transportation available when they were going to be drinking away from the house. A really important thing that we learned here that we had not done in previous studies like this, when we were looking at legislation previously, is now looking at the alcohol sales, tax revenues, and tourism. And what we saw was that alcohol sales continued to increase after the law was effective. And state revenues from taxes related to hospitality continued to rise. Tourism also continued to increase and was in fact the highest as it had been in 2019. And then, as I noted, our report also documents the legislative history, where we truly went in and looked at the transcripts, and all that information is in our report. And the point of having it there is, again, so other states can know what to expect, and so that they have information both pro and con, and the arguments that will be used, or the statements of impact that others will be making. So everyone has the best information they have for making decisions for their state. In summary, after they lowered their law from 08 to 05, there was a general reduction in crashes. There is a reduction in fatal crashes and fatalities. There is no negative impact on the criminal justice system. I didn't really speak to that, but along the way, as we checked on law enforcement, we never heard any negative impact. We didn't hear that officers had a tough time or that they had we didn't hear any negative impact about criminal justice, either from officers or prosecutors or any point in the system. And the study did not find any negative impact on the hospitality industry. Here's the citation and then a link for the report that I mentioned. It was released in February, and then also the traffic tech is a 2-page summary. And I thank you for the ability to be here and that you invited us, and I am excited to listen to the discussion.
Thank you, Amy. NHTSA's evaluation is important and it's encouraging. We appreciate your briefing. Now, I would like to ask Jana to rejoin us. In addition, we are privileged to have Dr. Bella Dinzar of the Traffic Injury Research Foundation and the FIA Foundation. Bella is also the former vice chairman of the NTSB. Also with us is Tara Gill of Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, and Jane Terry of the National Safety Council. If all of our panelists would please turn on their cameras and their microphones. I welcome all of our panelists. I have questions for each of you. In addition, I'll remind those watching to please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen if you have questions for our panelists. One of our team members is monitoring the chat, and we'll do our best to work in as many of your questions as possible. To get us started, we've heard from Jana Price and Amy Berning regarding their involvement in the .05 BAC effort. I want to provide an opportunity for our other panelists to introduce themselves and to share their organization's involvement with the .05 issue. And Bella, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Board Member Tom Chapman. It's great that you're hosting this timely roundtable, and we really thank you for that. I think it couldn't come at a better time. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bella Dinzar, and I had the privilege of working with the good people at the NTSB for 4 years, and I'm now delighted to serve as the Senior Advisor for Public Health and Transportation for 2 international foundations. TURF is a research foundation based in the US and Canada, and the FIA Foundation is an international philanthropy based in the UK. And both have worked on advancing road safety around the world in many different ways. So how have they been involved in drinking and driving, I think is a question. TURF is well known for working with NHTSA and US DOT and providing assistance, technical assistance in the states, at least 40 of them, especially on issues related to DUI, such as interlocks. And also manages Canada's National Road Fatality Database, which is a great source of information on how laws affect alcohol-related fatal crashes. The FIA Foundation has funded many international road safety efforts, such as with the World Health Organization, or WHO, and WHO, of course, strongly supports .05 BAC laws internationally and has done that for many years now. So, and finally, I guess I should mention that as a volunteer effort with former NHTSA and CDC leaders, I co-founded the .05 Saves Lives Coalition as a way of providing easy access and information to states that want to pass an .05 law. And now there is so much great information, as we've heard from Jana and Amy today. Supporters who, the boldest supporters were our members from the beginning, like Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety and National Safety Council. We still do get questions from people working in their states to try to get some movement on their own bills. And there's so much good evidence out there. So as a volunteer effort, we'll keep doing it as long as we can be helpful. But I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for having us.
Thank you, Bella. Tara, you're next. Tell us about yourself and the role of advocates.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tom, and really glad to be here today with my fellow panelists. So Advocates we're a nonprofit traffic safety organization located in Washington, D.C., but we work in all 50 state legislatures, the D.C. Council and Congress to advance state and federal legislation and federal regulations to improve road safety. Much like the NTSB, we were early supporters of .05, having adopted policy in 1993. We work closely with the NTSB and other organizations, state legislators, and the governor's office to get the .05 BAC law over the finish line in Utah in 2017. And then once it was enacted, to protect the new law until it went into effect at the end of 2018. So we take a comprehensive approach to traffic safety, and our mission is to advance safe road users, safe vehicles, and safe roads. And the mission may sound very, very similar to a safe system approach, which it is. And as many of you know, the safe system approach has been adopted by the US DOT, NTSB, and many others, and is being increasingly employed to upgrade road safety for all road users, which is terrific. So state traffic safety laws like .05 BAC, vehicle safety upgrades like impaired driving prevention technology, and road safety improvements like separated bike lanes and accessible sidewalks. These are all key components to a comprehensive approach to preventing deaths and injury due to impaired driving crashes. And, you said it before, the time to advance these underused solutions in the US is now. Dangerous driving, including impaired driving, speeding, and lack of seatbelt use, are all up across the country, and traffic fatalities have risen over the last couple of years. From our point of view, we have the proven solutions to this problem, including 0.05 BAC, and we need to move forward with the policy and the other solutions, keep people out of emergency rooms, and save lives. And we definitely look forward to working collaboratively with groups, agencies, other organizations, and with more states and state legislators to lower the limit of BAC while driving.
Thank you, Tara. Jane, you're our NTSB, one of our NTSB alums on the panel here, now with NSC. Tell us about your current role and the role of NSC.
Well, thanks, Member Chapman, for having me here today, or Tom, as you told us to call you. Yes, I was lucky enough to learn so much about this issue when I was at NTSB, when the original Reaching Zero report was enacted. And I took a lot of that knowledge and really added to what the National Safety Council is doing. And at NSC, I lead government affairs for state and federal outreach to change policies. Just a little background on the National Safety Council. We're over 100-year-old nonprofit that was founded by the business community. We do a lot of work on workplace safety issues, and we absolutely think that roadway safety and know that roadway safety is a workplace safety issue. And actually, 40% of the at-work fatalities are a result of motor vehicle crashes. So we know there's a lot more we can do to improve safety. And certainly has been well established by my colleagues here today, impaired driving is one of those areas where we can really act here. And so I've been able to work with some of our experts at the National Safety Council, like our Alcohol and Drug Impairment Division, which has toxicologists from around the United States who work on these issues day in and day out. They were also leaders on lowering the BAC level. And so taking some of their knowledge and sharing that with policymakers at both the state and federal levels to help try to influence and get the change that we're all looking for. Because we know that especially these types of fatalities, impaired driving fatalities, it's been stagnant for the past few decades. And we need to make dramatic moves, such as lowering the BAC, which because of the research that Amy already laid out, we know will move the needle in the right direction here. So we need to make these dramatic moves and bold moves to really save lives on the roads. So thank you for taking some time to focus on this issue today. And I'm happy to be here.
Well, welcome to all of our panelists. I have some prepared questions, which I'm going to work through today as we go along. But Leah Walton, our colleague at NTSB, is monitoring the chat. Leah, if you have questions you want to share with us, please feel free to do so. I'm going to start at this point, though, with a question for Bella. Bella, tell us about the international perspective based on your experience with TURF and FIA Foundation. And have other countries transitioned from a higher BAC to a lower level? And what was the process for doing so?
Thank you for that question. Well, I mean, the current BAC limits around the world range from everywhere from 0.0 to as high as 0.15, but the vast majority of countries actually have a limit of 0.05 to 0.08, with almost every industrialized high-income country having a 0.05 BAC or lower. As I mentioned, WHO has recommended this for years. So for many countries, the road to 0.5 started a while ago. I mean, even if not as early as Norway, as we mentioned before, Australia, France, Germany, Greece, they all passed an 0.5 law or lower in the 90s. And these are countries that consider drinking as part of their culture in many ways. So perhaps, the process of acceptance by both the public and the hospitality industry. Perhaps there was more acceptance in a way because they didn't have anyone, as we have had in the US, framing an 05 law as an attack on drinking itself. That's what some opponents have tried to imply here in the US, that we're attacking the process of drinking. But there, in Europe and many other places, Australia, New Zealand, it was really viewed as just a safe driving measure, had nothing to do with drinking. So I suppose because 05 has been enacted for so many years in so many countries, there are dozens of excellent international studies showing the safety benefits of this. And because it has a clear life-saving benefit. So even more countries use that to lower their BAC levels. So all of these countries, as I think you mentioned earlier, Tom, showed that the fatality risk is less not only for driver who are between 0.05 and 0.079, but at all BAC levels. So I think that's a really important point that is, that we can take from our international colleagues, is that why most countries have a lower rate of drinking and driving deaths and injuries. It's lowering all types of drinking and driving, even at high BACs. I think we'll always have naysayers who point out that each country is different. And that's true. I mean, they'll say we have different constitutions, we have different enforcement. For example, Australia allows random breath testing. But I think these international examples point us in the right direction. And now, as we've seen, we have great studies from NHTSA, from NTSB, a huge report from the National Academies of Science from a few years ago, real world data from Utah. So I think that we need to remember that. And in addition to that, we have, using these international results as a guide, there's a study by Dr. Fell, who showed that if every state passed an 05 law, we would save 1,800 lives in the first year alone. I think we can't forget that. I mean, 1,800 people could be prevented from dying if we followed our international colleagues. So,
and Bella, there's some 100 countries with set the BAC at 0.05 or lower. Is that correct?
That's right. In some way. I mean, some of them, there are different types of laws. It might be administrative license revocations rather than criminal.
Yeah. Jane, for you, a question regarding the National Safety Council's work. You all work closely with business fleet owners and commercial vehicle drivers. I understand that the Motor Carrier Safety Planner, which is produced annually, I believe, by FMCSA, states that drivers are forbidden from consuming alcohol or being under the influence of alcohol within 4 hours of going on duty or operating a commercial motor vehicle. In addition, I believe some states have a more restrictive BAC limit for commercial motor vehicle drivers, and that's sometimes set as low as 0.04. Tell us about this, and should there be a variation between commercial motor vehicle drivers and passenger vehicle drivers?
At the National Safety Council, what we advocate for is really separating the act of driving from that of consuming alcohol and other impairing substances. So you just need to plan better, whether you're driving for personal reasons or for business reasons. And this really can be an issue when you think about commercial drivers potentially driving an 80,000-pound truck or a bus full of children. You really want people who are going to be alert and paying attention to the road and ready to respond. I think one of the things that we take for granted is the fact that for the vast majority of us, the trips that we make in a vehicle are safe. We arrive to and from and travel to and from places on a pretty regular basis safely. And this impacts our culture. And so in that way, we're not necessarily prioritizing the things that we should prioritize because we think, because we've done it all these other times, we can do it safely again. And so it's a lot of different factors here, but certainly separating, as I said, the act of driving from consuming impairing substances, and also looking at how we look at roadway safety and really thinking about the culture and attitudes that we take each and every time we get behind the wheel get on a bike, or go out for a walk on the road.
Yeah, my background, as you probably know, is aviation, and in aviation, the federal rule is often referred to as 8 hours from bottle to throttle. And I don't know that applies strictly speaking with respect to driving, but certainly separating your drinking activities from your driving activities, in my view, makes perfect sense. And we have examples of that in other industries. And I think it's a cultural shift that we need to try to encourage people to employ in their personal lives. Leah, any questions from our participants today?
Yes, we sure do. The question I'm going to direct first at Jana, but then I think other panelists perhaps could share. When Oregon was discussing a BAC of 0.05, there was some interest and discussion in the concept of 0.00. Can you reflect on why NTSB decided on 0.05 and not on 0.0?
Thanks, Leah, and thanks to that questioner. Well, I will just go back to the text of the recommendation itself, which is NTSB called on states to set per se BAC levels of 0.05 or lower. So, in fact, NTSB would support lower BAC per se levels. I think that what we saw when we looked at the data was that a level of 0.05 is about where you start to see a significant uptick in the odds of crashing. So that is not to say that a lower limit wouldn't be a good thing. And as Bella Denzar mentioned, many countries around the world have chosen to make levels of, for example, 0.02. So, and I will mention, just like Jane Terry said, the idea is to separate the act of drinking from driving. And we understand that, different states will have different policies that they want to pursue, but certainly 0.05 or lower is something that the research would support.
Leah, other questions?
Yes. Did you look at the changes in numbers and proportion of fatalities, including in comparison to the United States? And I believe that's going to Amy Berning.
Hi. Yes, we did. And so I had a slide that showed where we were looking at changes across several different measures with crash data, and then and we saw decreases across the board in measures of crashes, and then also drivers who were in crashes and their BACs. And then for the in relationship to comparing to the US as a whole, we looked at fatality data and did that. And the US had a downward trend at the same time, which is excellent, but Utah's downward trend was at a higher degree.
And Amy, I'm going to pick up from there. You were involved in NHTSA's evaluations of the California and Illinois law changes, which were two of the states that first moved from higher BAC limits to 0.08 a number of years ago. And how do the results from those states in earlier years compare with the results we're seeing so far in Utah?
So actually, pretty much exactly on track with each other. So as you mentioned, California was the fourth state to come in. So definitely an early adopter. Illinois wasn't much further behind. And we did evaluations of both of those, and basically the same methodology that we did here. We tweaked things along the way, but it was same sort of basic measures that we're looking at. And both of those had had reductions in alcohol-related fatalities as well. We did trend analysis in those studies, and both of them, California was about 12%, Illinois about 13% reduction in alcohol-related fatalities of what would have been projected if there had been no law change. So pretty much right in line with Utah. And also for those two states also saw no, for what we examined, no negative impacts. So no negative impacts on law enforcement, on criminal justice, prosecutors, jails. Everything really went smoothly.
Do you recall roughly when those studies were done?
California was a publication in 1991. Illinois, a couple years later, they were both in the 1990s.
Okay, early 1990s. Tara, a question for you. Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety annually publishes what you all call your roadmap of state highway safety laws. What are the criteria for including state laws in your roadmap? And is Utah's .05 law listed in the current advocates roadmap?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for bringing attention to the roadmap of state highway safety laws report. I just want to, for the audience, we usually release the report in January, but this year we're actually planning to release the 20th anniversary edition in December. So stay tuned for that. And for those who aren't familiar with the roadmap report, it rates states in 5 major categories, including impaired driving, occupant protection, child passenger safety, graduated driver licensing, and distracted driving. And it rates states on their adoption of what we call, critical traffic safety laws in that category that every state should pass. And we also identify other solutions to improve vehicle and road safety in the report. So we added information on .05 BAC policy to our 2018 roadmap report. And this was the first report to be released after Utah passed its law. And we often spotlight information on a policy before we start rating the states on the new policy, sort of to give them a heads up of what's going to be coming in a couple of years. And we added information on .05 at the time because there was a fair amount of interest in the policy after Utah passed its law. And we were really hopeful that other states would soon follow their example. And the report's a great opportunity for us to educate on traffic safety countermeasures. So, we seize the moment to include .05. And there's also, as Bella and Amy and Jana have talked about, a wide breadth of research from around the world showing the life-saving benefits of lowering BAC limits. And that also helped to propel our interest in including it. We're a small organization and we don't do our own research. So we really rely on the research and recommendations of NTSB, NHTSA, and other traffic safety organizations who do research to help us identify and make policy decisions. We did hope to progress on rating the states on .05 BAC, but with only one state having passed the law, it's not really reasonable for us to start rating at this time, but we really hope to do so in the near future. And for those interested in seeing the report, you can download a copy from our website at saferoads.org.
And again, your roadmap is an annual product, correct?
It is an annual product. That is correct.
Great, thank you. Before I proceed with my prepared questions, Leah, anything coming in from our participants?
Yes, we have a lively group and I'm very excited to share that. We have a question for, first of all, a compliment, great initiative from the NTSB to have this safety recommendation. But BAC can be an invasive test requiring a blood draw. How will states, law enforcement, perhaps NHTSA, work around the legal and technical caveats for obtaining a valid BAC for .05?
I can add a little bit there, if that's okay. So certainly there's what's called implied consent on some of this testing, which essentially means that you, when you get your driver's license, are saying you're going to follow the rules of the road. And when a BAC limit is set by a state, that becomes the law. And if you are pulled over and asked for a test to test your BAC, some states cover this under implied consent, that when you got your license, it was a deal you made that you would follow the laws. And that's such an important compact there that I think that people who are driving don't necessarily fully understand. And it's important for state lawmakers to look at what are their laws around this, and especially when we're thinking about advances in oral fluid testing, where you can just take a swab and get samples from actually inside the mouth to detect if there is a presence of impairing substances. A lot more states are moving to this. And so it's important for state lawmakers working with your state highway safety offices, with your state toxicologists and others, to take a look at these laws that are on your books to ensure that you have the authority to be able to enforce the laws that you have on your books as well.
It's a good question, and it probably turns to some extent on the specifics with regard to the law of individual states. But I guess I would posit that as a general matter, the process isn't changed. What's really changed is the standard. And so while I think it's something that we certainly need to be mindful of, and I think legislators would be wise to take a good look at this and how it will work in the field, I'm not sure it's actually that complicated. I think it's a matter of changing the standard, but not necessarily changing the legal process and frankly the physical process of obtaining samples. Any of our other panelists want to weigh in on this? Bella?
I think that's exactly right, Member Chapman, is that, I mean, there's going to be training, but there would have been training anyway for officers to under a 0.08 law. But the studies in other countries have shown that when a country has changed from a 0.08 to a 0.05 or lower, there's been no undue burden in training or any problems, reported by law enforcement or the court system. So there is some precedent to not having any problems related to that in other countries.
Yeah. Others input on this question?
I just like to, go ahead, Amy.
Leah, the question was about blood?
Yes, the question was framed around blood collection for BAC.
So I'm unsure of the question, since the predominant would still be breath. And as Bella noted, law enforcement hasn't, from states, entities, countries, states that have lowered laws in the past, there haven't ever been known difficulties for law enforcement.
Kara?
I was just going to add that, the issue came up when the Utah bill was being considered. And, how will we enforce this? What is going to happen? And, we needed to do some calming messaging at the time saying, the police have their procedures in place. There will be some training, but they have procedures that they will continue to follow. From the opposition, it sounded like 0.05 BAC was going to be passed, and then people were going to be pulled over for no reason and accused of impaired driving. But the same procedures are in place. The police will evaluate the cognitive and physical components, and make determinations about whether to progress or to release the person who's driving. And Utah, when we've spoken with law enforcement in Utah, they seem to have it under control. And they took a very sort of, we'll do this, we'll figure it out attitude, like we can handle it. And so they have.
And again, Amy, your evaluation, or NHTSA's evaluation of the application of the law so far has not shown any significant impacts in terms of the criminal justice system. Is that correct?
Yes. So our study didn't go in depth in that issue, but we definitely did not hear of any issues
Right.
in the meetings
Right.
that our group attended or that we've heard from the regional office or from the state itself.
Yeah, and obviously your input there would be more anecdotal, but at least anecdotally, there's no indication of any problems. Yeah, it's a good question, though. Leah, other questions?
Yes, alcohol impairment is heavily involved in motorcycle crashes. How would a lower BAC impact motorcycle riders?
Who wants to take that one? Bella, you want to take a shot at that one?
Well, a lower BAC is, related to the last question as well, it's a deterrent. We have to remember that as well. So it's a psychological deterrent. So we have to remember that, it's actually going to reduce people's willingness to get behind any kind of vehicle after they've been drinking because they don't wish to have the penalty. So it's a behavioral deterrent rather than, which is very broad. Since I think I'm sort of representing the international side on this, internationally, it's also been a deterrent to the number of alcohol impaired motorcycle riders as well.
Yeah, I guess I would anticipate, at least based upon what we've seen from NHTSA's evaluation so far, that we would see an impact that pretty much parallels the impact across the board with respect to all classes of drivers. But interesting, though, interesting point with respect to the prevalence among motorcycle accidents. Leah, next question for us.
Yes, and this one I believe I'm going to start with Jana. Alcohol consumption is very important. However, isn't motor vehicle crashes showing more drug impairment involved in collisions? And how is NTSB addressing the other issues of drug impairment?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Drug impairment is certainly something that's of interest to NTSB and something that we have seen in both drug-impaired driving, polydrug impaired driving, meaning driving with multiple drugs, including not necessarily excluding alcohol. So the mixture of alcohol and other drugs and drug-impaired driving is something that we are very interested in. Most studies that have looked at this have shown that the number one drug that impairs driving is alcohol. So I think it's really important for us as we expand our portfolio and look at how other drugs can impair driving, that we continue to have a strong focus on alcohol, which is the drug that we know is both most prevalently used and with a very known relationship between it and performance and crash risk. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at other drugs. And we are looking at other drugs, and we are interested in looking at countermeasures for preventing impaired driving from all substances.
Yeah, this is a major area of focus for us here at NTSB, and I know all of our safety partners as well. And the fact that we're not focusing on it specifically today shouldn't be interpreted in any way as suggesting that we don't see it as a big problem. Lots of challenges here, and it's becoming more of a problem. Increasingly more serious. We've seen it in a number of our recent higher profile investigations, drug use and polydrug use, and of course the whole challenge of testing, and then complicated by at least the ostensible legalization of marijuana on the state level. This is really quite a complicated question, and frankly a topic for a whole nother roundtable. But again, alcohol is where the biggest problem is, and thus our focus today on the .05 initiative. Others want to weigh in on this?
I'll just add that there are a few different provisions in the infrastructure bill that passed and was signed into law to look at the polysubstance driving issue. And it's certainly something that we've got our eye on. And just to credit NTSB, I mean, in the work that you've done previously, your recommendations states don't stop at the alcohol test, continue to your testing to figure out what drugs may be present as well. Because as y'all pointed out, a lot of places will stop if they get the 0.08 or higher. And so we need to really have a better understanding of that drug-impaired driving problem and polysubstance impaired driving problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, I've got a question for you. In the U.S., alcohol-impaired driving deaths persistently comprise a high percentage of overall vehicle crash deaths, about 1/3 typically. How does that trend in the United States compare with what we see in Europe and Canada?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, as the European Transport Safety Council says themselves, Europe is the heaviest drinking region in the world. They actually have that as a statement. And, despite that, their proportion of motor vehicle deaths related to alcohol in most countries is still less than in the US. An example, it would be like Sweden. It's between 20 and 24%. Switzerland is around 14 to 16%, something like that. So Australia is a little bit closer to us, not in Europe, but another country that we often compare ourselves to. They're closer to around maybe around 28 or so percent. But most countries and Canada is a country that is still less than a third, but in the 20s as far as the percent of motor vehicle deaths related to alcohol. So I think that the point is, though, that in all of these countries, they've done plenty of studies showing that having that lower BAC did reduce their road traffic injuries and deaths related to alcohol, no matter where they started off with. It always lowered it. There was a fairly recent study in Ontario that showed that having the 0.05 law reduced serious collisions, serious injuries and collisions, related to alcohol. So I think that the data are, the evidence is definitely there, and perhaps it's part of that whole psychology we were talking about before, the deterrent psychology. There's this theory of deterrence where laws are really effective when the consequences are swift and certain. And that is one thing that is true in Canada and other countries around the world. Although most penalties in Canada are administrative rather than criminal, then the penalties are actually predictable and instantaneous. You immediately get penalties like 7-day license suspensions or a car impoundment or an alcohol ignition lock installed. So, a lot of the Canadian provinces have really increased their DUI penalties in the past 20 years or so. And that seems to have an effect because a lot of the alcohol-related traffic deaths in Canada have fallen in the last 10 to 20 years as well.
Well, and I think a foundation of what you're saying too is none of us here, while all of us support 0.05, none of us are suggesting that that's a complete answer to the challenge we face in terms of drinking and driving. But we do think it's an important tool for bringing those numbers down significantly. There are going to be long-term challenges on this. It's not going to go away, but we think that this is the most important tool available to us, at least at this point, to try to get those numbers down. Others want to weigh in on this? Leah, what are our participants asking us?
I think Jana was going to pipe in.
I just wanted to echo part of what Ella said about some of the Canadian provinces. I think some of what we've seen there is kind of exciting and innovative in terms of the administrative sanctions that deliver a very clear and swift administrative sanction for driving at, for example, between 0.05 and 0.08. I think the research shows that those had a lot of success without necessarily having a criminal element to the offense. So I think that's very interesting and something that is worth looking into.
Yeah, and again, the prompt response there being the key to it. Yeah, good point. Very good point.
Yeah, and Tom, if I can just jump in on the administrative penalties, because they looked at administrative penalties after the 0.05 BAC law went into effect in Utah, because they had multiple special sessions and a full regular session in 2018 to make changes to the law after it was enacted. And ultimately what they found, because there are a handful of states, like 7 or 8, that have administrative laws at 0.05 to 0.079, but they aren't really enforced in the same way. And because we lack those clear, swift repercussions that Bella mentioned, that really going after criminal 0.05 BAC would be the most effective change. So they wound up sticking with the criminal penalty in Utah, and that's the law that went into effect. And it's actually it makes the process sort of simple when you're changing your law, because you're just changing out 0.08 for 0.05.
Yeah, changing a legal standard, right?
Yeah, everything else is in place. And because our two systems are so different, it can be difficult to compare with Canada.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I mean, and I think we certainly would acknowledge that, again, we're looking at 0.05 in a lot of countries around the world, but the systems do differ, and it's not always a direct comparison. But the data certainly indicates that the impact of 0.05 is a positive one, regardless of the country, regardless of the system. Bella, you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Others want to weigh in on this particular question? Leah, I'm going to turn back to you. You have some more questions for us?
Yes, I do. And I believe this question will go to Bella and perhaps Amy as well. Has the process for alcohol abuse treatment changed with a lower BAC? One of the hopes is that people who need treatment get early intervention. And the person asking the question is asking if there had been any impact on that in Utah, but I feel as though internationally, Bella, you may have some perspective as well.
That's a good question. I mean, I actually used to look at brief interventions related to alcohol, injuries related to alcohol impairment for a systematic review in my younger research days. I mean, that's definitely an important part of, the whole system. I mean, we're talking about safe system, right? The safe system approach. And really, even though we're talking about it mostly within the transportation context, there is a wider world of health and well-being that transportation affects. So, yeah, I mean, other countries do have, some countries do, definitely have a treatment portion. I don't know how, it's been studied or looked at, in Utah, if at all, but maybe Amy can speak to that a little better, or someone else. But I definitely think that, as part of the, the whole process of addressing the issue of impairment, I mean, part of it is also interventions to, from the public health perspective, interventions to reduce alcohol issues, as well as alcohol, related driving.
It's a very thoughtful question. I haven't looked at it myself. It feels like it's too early to know, but perhaps not. But certainly a thoughtful question. Amy, any sense on that?
No, unfortunately not. I too appreciate the question, but I don't have any information I can add on it.
Yeah. Leah, other questions for us?
No other questions at this time.
All right. Jane and Farah, I have questions for you regarding the work of your organizations. Both organizations quite active in state advocacy for .05 laws. Currently, which states are you seeing as most actively considering .05 laws, and where do you see the best opportunities for progress?
Jane, do you want me to start and then, okay. So yeah, there have been a handful of states that in the last, since Utah, the successful effort in 2017, since they got that across the finish line, that have looked at .05 BAC. And those include the aforementioned Oregon, California, Delaware, Hawaii, Michigan, Vermont, and New York. And the bills in Hawaii have made the most progress. They passed a chamber a couple of sessions in a row, but that have not advanced through the House. I think they've gone through the Senate, but not the House. So we're definitely looking at Hawaii closely, and then an advocate on .05 who we work really closely with recently had some good meetings in California to talk about the policy and the effort. There had been a bill a couple of years ago that just lasted one session and it didn't come back. So, he's definitely hoping that he can at least get a bill introduced. And mounting a bill effort is so important because it builds awareness of the countermeasure, and it really gives us an opportunity to educate on the issue. Even negative press can sometimes be an opportunity for you to come back around and say, well, actually, or, here's all this great research that's come out, like Bella mentioned, the National Academies of Sciences and NTSB's report and NHTSA's new report. So we have this breadth of information. And I should not forget to mention, the terrific work that Jim Fell has done on .05 BAC and impaired driving, and he and his colleagues at NORC, and also, acted as a very supportive go-to when we have questions that we need answered. And I'd add too that MAD coming on board with .05 BAC in 2019 was really an incredible boon and helped draw attention to the policy and the issue. And I think, is definitely a stair step, MAD participating on a policy or an issue, to states really seriously considering it, because MAD has chapters in every state, and their victim advocates are really the voice and the heart of efforts to end impaired driving. And so that's really helpful as well.
Jane, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, we've been certainly involved really in lockstep with advocates and Bella and NTSB in the states that have been mentioned here. And I think one of the things, just to pick up a little bit on what Tara had mentioned, is that so many of these bills that have been introduced at the state level are written as a result of tragedy. And how can we get some bold leaders to be proactive and really step up, introduce these bills, move them through with their colleagues, instead of reactive to these fatal crashes and just heart-wrenching crashes that happen each and every day in the United States. And if you're interested in getting involved in this, please come and join us. We work together as a coalition and really try to believe there's strength in numbers and make sure that we're supporting the folks on the ground. Unfortunately, we have had some legislators who aren't quite there yet, and we will continue to work with those folks. I think having a legal BAC of .08 for so many years has made people complacent again, and they just think, well, if that's the legal standard, that's where we should be. And it just takes time sometimes to educate them about the issues. Certainly forums like this are important, and having groups like the ones represented here in this webinar today to go out and educate, the great research of NHTSA, reports from NTSB. Those are all helpful to what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and Tom, I should mention one state that I forgot but just remembered, and that's Washington State. At the end of the session, they did have a 0.05 BAC bill, and we're very hopeful it'll come back next session.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Tara. I was feeling remiss because I didn't have Washington on my slide where I had mentioned legislation, and in fact, Mark McKechnie of the Washington Traffic Safety Commission reached out to tell me that Washington has not once but twice introduced such legislation, and that they're planning to reintroduce it in 2023. So that big shout out to them, to Washington State.
Well, this will be a marathon, not a sprint. And I think we're all hopeful that we might see another couple of states in the next year or two, because we'll need some momentum, I think, to start to pick up here in order to see a longer term trend moving this direction towards 0.05. Bella, somewhat related to this, you championed 0.05 BAC laws when you were here at NTSB. Share your perspective on how the effort has gained momentum, and recall for us the advocacy actions you took to advance the initiative in the relatively early stages.
Thanks, Tom. You're taking me back down memory lane a little bit. But as Dr. Jana Price described so well, the movement to support states that wanted to pass an 05 law started long before I arrived at the NTSB, with the recommendation and the Reaching Zero report that Jana was instrumental in. But as for me, I mean, I've always had a personal professional interest in preventing drinking and driving, maybe because of my public health background, and it's so preventable. So when I first arrived at the NTSB in 2015, I just tried to make myself available to anyone who wanted to talk about how to prevent these needless deaths and injuries. I mean, people, members of the public, media, legislators, and as you know, Tom, as an NTSB board member, you have a great platform, to talk about life-saving issues. So that's how I met some of the great advocates that Tara and Jane were mentioning before, like Liam's Life in California and RID USA in New York. And so I just wanted to be as open and helpful and use the great information at the NTSB as much as possible. And I have to tell you, there were so many people who told me I was wasting my time because it seemed like no state was ready at that time. This was 2015. But I was lucky to work with really good people at the NTSB and have other, outside, support, like, advocates. And we kept an open mind, and we were at it for a while, giving interviews, talking with people, when just kind of out of the blue, some of my former colleagues and friends in Utah urged State Representative Thurston and Senator Adams to contact me because they were thinking about proposing this 05 law. That's how, I first heard about it. And from there, of course, we had wonderful allies, with Tara and Rolane Fairclough, who was with AAA Utah at the time, and a lot of others. But as to the second part of your question, how do we actually advance the initiative? I think that during key moments in Utah, and Tara can definitely speak to this more, but when the governor was deciding whether to support 05, when opponents were pouring money into ads, which we can also tell you about later, I was lucky to have this platform that you have now and which you're using now, Tom, of being an NTSB board member. And so I flew to Utah twice at the invitation of the legislature. We wrote op-eds for Utah and national newspapers. We gave interviews in Salt Lake City and in DC. And, sometimes we were personally attacked. I don't know if that's still happening, but I just always laugh and remember being called, quote, that lady from the NTSB who is lying to you. That was actually my title. But we also had plenty of good moments too, like the reporter from one of the less complimentary to the NTSB newspapers who interviewed me and an anti-05 lobbyist. for a 2-part interview. But then when the story came out, he only featured my part of the interview. So I was kind of surprised. And I asked him, because the newspaper hadn't been very supportive before. And I asked him what happened. You didn't include the other side that, you had obviously supported more before, we thought. And he said, Bella, I'm a journalist and I can't report something that's so obviously untrue. So I think that our sticking to the facts at the NTSB really, advance things, definitely within the media. And then, a key part is that Leah Walton and Stephanie Shaw and all of the good people at the advocacy team, they were really instrumental to this, was the messaging. I mean, we focused, as Jane said, it was about separating drinking and driving. The opponents of 05, especially the unethical lobbyists that I rant on and on about, who are making money off scaring good business owners, they really tried to make people think that we were these antisocial people against drinking. But we just focus on the facts and just a simple message that, don't mix drinking and driving. So my favorite graphic that the advocacy folks at NTSB did is the one that has the words choose one and then 2 boxes. One says drink and one says drive, a checkbox. So you just check one. So I think, I hope anyway, that it helped those in business, in the alcohol industry, understand that we're on the same side. I mean, they're on the same side of saving their customers' lives too, I would hope, and that these laws won't hurt their business. But the great thing is ultimately the NHTSA study showed in Utah that it didn't hurt business at all. So, we felt vindicated, I think. Sorry, a very long answer to a short question, Tom.
That's all right. You're still our secret weapon. Jana, Bella mentioned the Reaching Zero report, and we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of the Reaching Zero report. What's changed, in your view, what's changed on the landscape of impaired driving, and where do you see the greatest challenges?
Well, Tom, I think, as you mentioned in your introduction, one of the biggest challenges and biggest heartbreaks is seeing what's happened in the last couple of years in terms of the alcohol impaired fatalities and fatality rates increasing. So I think that really gives us all reason to really double down and think about all of the different solutions that we need to affect. The Reaching Zero report, 0.05, was a big message coming out of it, but we also had a lot of other messages. We continue to advocate for all convicted offender interlock laws. We are continuing to push for in-vehicle technologies that could prevent somebody from drinking and driving. We continue to support many different countermeasures that can address this problem. And we're continuing to both conduct research and review research done by others so that we can look at new creative ways to address the problem and also expand and consider looking at impaired driving from a range of potentially impairing substances. So on one hand, I think it's a tough time right now, but on the other hand, I think it's a really important time to galvanize and start working very hard on some of these issues. And I would, of course, invite my fellow panelists to chime in on that.
I'll just add, Jana makes a great point. The Reaching Zero report had a host of recommendations because this is such a multifaceted issue. And perhaps if you're working in a state that you think 0.05 doesn't gain traction, how can you educate policymakers maybe about some of the other things and bring them along at the same time as you're educating them about 0.05? So you may be able to say, increase or improve your ignition interlock law so that first offenders get ignition interlocks on their vehicles. And then to also take that time to educate about 0.05 and some of the other things that are in the Reaching Zero report. Because it's going to take a lot of different things to bring down, to reach zero. Yeah. And we have to look at all the options on the table.
Well, that's a really good point that both of you make. During my limited opportunity on the board, I've made impairment one of my priority issues, and certainly 0.05 is the highest priority within that portfolio. But we're not going to see 50 states adopt 0.05 in the time that I'll be serving on the board. And one of the things I like to try to do is look for opportunities where we can work on other aspects of the issue, find other ways to try to address this really staggering problem in terms of impaired driving. And I think it's a combination of factors, and we've got to keep in mind that there are other elements of this too that we need to try to address. 0.05 is important. We should continue to make that the highest priority, but it isn't the only priority within that portfolio of very challenging issues. Others want to weigh in on that one?
I would just jump in to say that we heard an argument in Utah when I was going through, like, this isn't the problem, this is, or this isn't the best solution, this is. And, like you said, and how NTSB and others work, we said, well, if there are multiple research-backed solutions that you're willing to, get across the finish line that will reduce impaired driving and, the outcomes, the fatalities, crashes, injuries, by all means, why not pursue multiple improvements at once? But you shouldn't toss out the effort on 0.05 because you think we should be going after something else.
Yeah.
There's why not do more? Let's, it's a big issue. It needs a lot of work. So
it is. It's a complicated issue. Leah, questions from our participants?
Yes, thank you. This question I'm going to toss to Jana first. In Ontario, penalties for 0.05 are administrative, where 0.08 is criminal. The legal process for 0.05 can involve only an alcohol screening breath device, whereas 0.08 requires an approved breath instrument. Is there a need to keep in mind the BAC limit with respect to severity of penalty, such as breath device use, etc.?
Wow. Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I think Tara made a good point before that we have some states in the United States that do have administrative limits, but it's enforcement is such an important part of all of that. Can you repeat, Leah, the idea of the question having to do with rather is like preliminary breath tests versus evidentiary breath tests? Is that kind of what the questioner was getting at?
That may be. Unfortunately, I'm just relaying what was given to me in the chat.
It sounds like this is the Canadian system. Is that right, Leah?
Yeah, it sounds like
I think what I heard is that in Ontario, the administrative sanctions can be based solely on a roadside breath test.
Yes.
Whereas the criminal sanctions or arrest process in the United States, in many states, employs an evidentiary breath test. To be honest, I don't have much knowledge about the difference between how you would use both of those. I know that in the United States, in most states, or in all states, I should say, it's not just a breath test. It's you are pulled over because an officer has observed driving behaviors that are indicative of impairment, and they go through a process of evaluating and assessing behavioral and physiological aspects through standardized field sobriety tests and other observations prior to making an arrest. And then when the arrest is made, the breath test takes place, and then subsequently the evidentiary test. So states in the United States don't just say, please, do a breath test. Whereas in other countries, as Bella mentioned, for example, in Australia, compulsory breath tests are more normative. So I don't know, maybe other panelists can do a better job on this question than I can.
Well, what I would say, Jana, and it's a point you made earlier in your answer, is that the key to this, whether it's a criminal penalty or an administrative penalty, is enforcement. The enforcement needs to be fair, but it needs to be prompt. Otherwise, the deterrent effect, frankly, of these sorts of measures, I think, is greatly diluted. So, from my perspective, the key here is not so much whether it's administrative or criminal, it's whether it's enforced fairly and enforced promptly.
And one of my Canadian colleagues, thank you, Michael Corbett, who is telling me that the Canadian provinces do use the screening device for the administrative, but then for the Canadian criminal sanctions, they also do evidentiary testing. So thanks for that assist.
Do others have a point of view on this, Bella?
And I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but if they would like to know more about, if they're asking specifically about different Canadian, enforcement or testing, I know that, turf.ca has a whole report, has lots of information about it. I should probably know it a little better myself, but, if they want to look that up, I'm not exactly sure what they're asking, but I know that, there's a lot of references there if they go to that website for Traffic Injury Research Foundation.
And for those that don't know, Bella's in Canada now. And so that's part of the reason her perspective here in terms of the Canadian situation is a little different from ours. Leah, other questions?
No other questions at this time.
I've got one for Jana and Bella, and y'all divide this up however you would like, but and this is an important one. It's my understanding that current data indicates that the BAC of drivers involved in fatal crashes is typically in the range of 0.16, which is twice the current legal limit in most states. Some opponents have argued that because the majority of alcohol-impaired drivers in fatal crashes have BAC levels well over 0.08, that lowering the allowable BAC to 0.05 is counterintuitive. With that in mind, and if the facts are correct, as I've outlined them here, how will lowering the BAC limit to 0.05 help us address the challenge with respect to those driving with much higher BAC levels?
Well, thanks, Tom. I'll take a stab at that and welcome Bella's input too. I think that's a common misconception and one that we addressed in the Reaching Zero report. The notion that a 0.05 law is somehow targeted only to people who were previously drinking around the 0.08 level. The reality is that lowering per se BAC limits has a broad deterrent effect. Many people, it's rare that a person knows what their blood alcohol level is when they're going out or having a drink or two drinks. But what they do know is if there has been high visibility enforcement and good communication about low BAC laws, that there's going to be a broad general deterrent effect on driving after drinking. And what the research has shown is that there is a lessening of fatalities across the spectrum. Sounds like Amy would like to chime in, or maybe Bella.
Bella, you can go.
Go ahead, Amy.
I just want to reiterate that Jana's on point with that. And we showed that our study showed that with the Utah data, that the impact is not at all only with people in that BAC range. It's across the BAC ranges. And the slide that I showed that had the two columns and the several different measures, we did categorize by those drivers who were 0.05 and above, and then also at the higher BACs, including 1.5 and above. And across the board, there's decreases. So, and that's the reasoning behind movements for different laws such as this. it makes sense to lower the limit if you're having a positive impact, and that impact has to be more than a specific population group.
And again, it's the deterrent
wide impact.
It's the deterrent impact and the behavioral impact across the board.
Yes. So that's what NHTSA has found so far with Utah, and then similarly with the studies back in the days with the other reductions and changes.
And now we have real world. Yeah, now we have real world information from Utah. But I mean, there is a huge mound of studies that have shown that drivers at all BAC stop getting behind the wheel when the BAC is lowered. So there's no question about that. But I think I'm glad you asked that question, Tom, because I think it's an important point to emphasize that opponents of O5 will always try to bamboozle us with this question about high BACs. And we just have to remember that, I mean, there is so much evidence to show that, there's this behavioral deterrence, a psychological deterrence that stops, high and low BAC drivers. So, I don't speak on behalf, this time I'm just speaking as Bella, not on behalf of my organizations and certainly not on behalf of NTSB or this webinar. But I feel like pleading to the hospitality and the alcohol industry and, anyone who is paying these unethical lobbyists to please stop wasting your money for people spreading things that aren't even true, that are not based on science, that have no studies backing it. But yet they'll still say it even after there's been, clear studies showing the opposite. I feel like these unethical anti-safety lobbyists have no argument left, since business and tourism were not hurt, police officers and courts didn't become overburdened, and people were actually saved from dying, because of O5. But yet they're still bringing out these tired arguments again and again. And, I don't know what we can do more to just nip that in the bud. Sorry, a little frustration, right?
No, I understand. I always like to say I'm a former lobbyist and a lawyer, and my mother is so ashamed.
No, and I'm not saying there aren't good lobbyists. There's great, but these are actually unethical lobbyists who are saying things that are not true. So, and costing people lives. So I'm not against all lobbyists. I didn't want to make that seem the case.
I understand. Tara, I want to actually just pick up. This is a good point to pick up on this issue. There was significant pushback in Utah when the .05 law was first proposed. What were the concerns that were raised? We've talked about some of them here today already, but what have we learned now that we've had real world experience with the Utah law?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a lot of pushback and a lot of, as Bella mentioned, money spent on ads and really catchy sound bites. But, short on actual proof, because the proof, the research that everybody's done shows that it's an effective policy. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, share my screen and show you some of the ads that I collected from 2017 and 18. Okay, does everybody have those?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this was a trio of ads that were put out, around that time when, I think what happened was the bill was introduced and nobody thought it was going to go anywhere. And then Bella showed up and the momentum just jumped up and it really started moving. So, the opponents got really nervous and they started taking out these ads left and right. So I know they might be a little hard to see on your screen, so I'll just give you a quick overview. The one on the far left is a letter from Colorado to Utah, totally tongue-in-cheek. And, opponents were concerned that, if Utah passes, Colorado might be the next state. So what they did is they ran this thank you note from Colorado thanking Utah for, adopting a 0.05 BAC limit. And, the subtext being that, nobody's going to want to go skiing or hiking or spend money in Utah anymore. And all those people that formerly went to Utah for their leisure activities are now going to come to Colorado. Colorado is very excited. The middle one, gets to, again, for skiers, which is a huge industry in Utah, that why would you come here just when you're relaxing and, you think things are great, you're going to get arrested for having, a drink with friends. And the last one targets one of my favorite because it goes after small women. And they were really sort of trying to fan the flames on that one, saying, you're going to come, you're going to have one glass of white wine with your friends, and you're going to get arrested on the way home. And if you're, just here visiting, you're on vacation, you might leave on probation. And that's a really clever tagline and hard to push back on when you have to get into, I'm willing to talk about the nuances, the data, and the points, but when you're pushing back on that one catchy tagline, it can definitely become difficult to do. And especially when you've, whipped up the public into a bit of a frenzy of panic over what this new law is going to do. So, we also pushed out a lot of earned media. We don't have the budget to take out these full page ads in the local papers, but we do have the sweat equity, and we did several letters to the editor and op-eds that were run similar to Bella. Anytime there was an opportunity to do media, we jumped at the chance. And, we also did a lot of work behind the scenes to counter the misinformation, within committees. And also we communicated early with the governor's office to make sure that that office was hearing both sides of the argument and not just the scary, fearful, not research-based side of the argument. So I will stop sharing my screen now.
And Tara, I just wanted to jump in. Brandy Nanini mentioned to me that those ads do not have any connection to responsibility.org. The website that's connected to it makes it kind of look as though it might be connected to them, but it is absolutely not. Those were placed and designed by the American Beverage Institute, which also, Brandy informed me, closed permanently in June.
Interesting.
Along those lines, while I'm on the line, there was an additional question about the beverage and hospitality industries. Have there been any representatives from these industries that have come out in favor of 0.05? And if so, what has motivated them?
That's a good question. And Brandy, by the way, thank you for the input. We appreciate that. Anybody want to take a shot at that question? I don't know the answer myself. Yeah, I don't know that we have an answer to that. I will say, Tara, I was born and raised in the great state of Colorado, and if you need someone to draft a counter proposal to the thank you note, I'll be happy to help with that. We are coming down to the last few minutes here. If we have folks that would like to submit some questions, we encourage you to do that as soon as possible because we're down to about our last 10 minutes or so. Leah, any questions?
No, not at this time. The questions are winding down.
Jana, next one for you. You mentioned the safe system approach to traffic safety, which is something all of us at NTSB are heavily focused on, the safety advocacy community in general, very much focused on the safe system approach. How are 0.05 BAC laws consistent with the safe system approach? How do they fit in with the safe system approach?
Thanks for that question, Tom. Well, as I alluded to before, we have many recommendations to address impairment and impaired driving, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about how this is all part of a safe systems approach and something that NTSB is certainly promotes regularly. When I'm not working on impairment research, I work on fatigue work. And, there are certain countermeasures that are out there that are not necessarily concerned about whether you are impaired by fatigue or by alcohol or substances, things like collision avoidance systems, things like highway barriers and rumble strips. So looking at all facets of the safety system and trying to make system level improvements that can either prevent crashes or prevent injury and fatalities when crashes happen is really what we need holistically to address this. Because, I do believe that impaired driving doesn't have to happen and that all impaired driving crashes are preventable. But the reality is that until we can have people make safe choices, we need a whole spectrum of countermeasures. And some of these other countermeasures, part of the safe systems approach, are really going to get us to zero quicker.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'm a big believer in the safe system approach, and we're focusing specifically on 0.05 today. It takes a holistic approach. Safety takes a holistic approach, and no matter what I'm talking about when I'm out on the road, whether I'm talking about aviation or rail or impairment or traffic safety, I always include at least a few words about the safe system approach and the importance of the safe system approach, because I do believe it has broad application. While the primary focus is traffic safety, I do believe it has a broad application across the board with respect to our approach to safety. Anybody else like to chime in on the issue with respect to 0.05 and the safe system approach?
I was just going to chime in and say, the safe system approach prioritizes data-driven countermeasures, and 0.05 certainly fits into that category, so it's appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it acknowledges that we're all human beings and we all make mistakes. And, we need all these things to fit together. So we're essentially kind of backing up the system. Anyway, thank you, Janet. Thanks for your comments on that. Leah, I have one last question here. But before I go to that, I want to see if we do have any other questions from our participants.
No other questions, but there was an ask to share the resources that were mentioned. And so I have dropped the NTSB Reaching Zero report, NHTSA's evaluation of Utah's 0.05 BAC law, as well as a web address to the 0.05 Saves Lives Coalition in the chat, and hopefully everyone is able to access that. And just as a reminder, this will be posted to our YouTube channel for future viewing for anyone who would like to share it with others.
Great, thank you for that. Jane, you get the last question. In 1983, Utah was the first state to lower its legal BAC limit from 0.10 to 0.08. But it wasn't until 2004 that all 50 states had set the BAC limit at 0.08. What national efforts, legislative or otherwise, took place during that 20-plus year time frame? And will we wait another 20-plus years for the rest of the U.S. to catch up to the 0.05 initiative?
Tom, I hope we won't have to wait another 20 years for states to lower their BAC level, because as we've proven here today, it does save lives and reduces fatalities on the roads. There was a lot of momentum and a lot of hard work that went into getting states to go to 0.08. Certainly the emergence and growth of MAD as just a rallying cry for states to lower that BAC by showing angry mothers their loss, their pain, to help drive the movement of policymakers was so important here. And the NTSB report, the Carrollton, Kentucky crash in 1988, where a school bus of children was hit by an alcohol-impaired driver, that helped change the minds of so many policymakers. But to my earlier point, a lot of this movement is as a result of tragedy, and we really need the bold leaders to step up. There's nothing prohibiting any state from making this change right now. We need the leadership to step up, make the change, and we're certainly there to support you, and really appreciate NTSB allowing this opportunity to get the facts out. Because as Tara pointed out, we can't always take out a full page ad, but NTSB giving voice to this issue is such an important way to help those policymakers really make the right decision here.
Thank you, Jane. And any others like to offer some comments? Tara?
Yeah, if I could just add one more resource. NHTSA has a great history of the move to 0.08 BAC. And when we started digging into the Utah effort, and I bring these arguments against going to 0.05, I was working really closely with Kathy Chase, who's now Advocates President, and Jackie Gillen, who is Advocates Past President. And they always had a really quick packaged response to, the opposition would say, we can't do it for this reason, and they'd have be able to counter it quickly. And, I found out it's because both of them, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Both of them were really intricately involved in the 0.08 BAC effort. And a lot of the arguments that came up during 0.08 BAC were brought up again. It's almost like the exact same playbook for 0.05. So if you want to educate yourself on what you might see in your state, if you, roll out a 0.05 BAC law, that NHTSA history is really tremendously helpful.
Anyone else have some final comments? Bella?
If I could say, advocates is the secret weapon here. They are amazing at, giving you information when you need it. So I hope that states and people and, state advocates will reach out to them as well. But thank you so much, Tom. Just wanted to say thank you. And just to tell everyone, keep up the fight.
Thanks to all of you. And I'm going to invite all of you now to turn off your cameras and your microphones. I'm going to offer a few closing remarks. I hope all of you have found this to be a helpful and informative 2 hours. We've received the science and background supporting the development of the NTSB 0.05 safety recommendation. We've examined the promising results yielded so far as a result of Utah's 0.05 BAC law. We've learned more about the international experience. We've sought to dispel the arguments made by opponents of 0.05 laws. And we've identified some strategies for advocating 0.05 legislation in other states. I want to thank all the panelists for their time, their expertise, their insights, and most important, their devotion to preventing alcohol-impaired traffic deaths and serious injuries. I also want to thank Leah Walton and all of our behind-the-scenes team here at NTSB for organizing the roundtable and for managing the details. Again, this is part one of NTSB's Most Wanted List Roundtable to consider the safety benefits of 0.05 BAC laws. In the fall, we'll host part two of our roundtable series titled State Legislative Primer to 0.05 BAC laws. Please follow our various social media outlets where we'll post the announcement with the details. On behalf of today's panelists and all of us at NTSB, we appreciate those of you who have taken time to watch today's roundtable. Your interest is a critical element in our shared objective to address the tragic and growing number of avoidable deaths among all road users. Enjoy the remainder of your afternoon.